Welcome to the Inspiring Good podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Community Foundation of Elkhart County, which serves a vibrant community in northern Indiana known for its generosity and strong network of nonprofit organizations. I'm Marshall King, who is hosting this podcast solo for the time being. Our guest today is Bob Deputy, a longtime business and civic leader in Elkhart, as well as a donor and philanthropist. Welcome to the Inspiring Good podcast, Bob.
Thanks, Marshall.
So your family's history is really intertwined with Elkhart's story. I learned from touring the Ruthmere Museum that your family lived there for a time, and talk about some of the roots that your family has in Elkhart.
Yes, we lived in Ruthmere. As luck would have it, after the Second World War, my parents were moving from Nebraska to Indiana and had chosen to come to the South Bend, Elkhart area. My mother was with child and was going to have a baby pretty quickly, so they needed a house they could get into now. And the Ruthmere property was for sale, and since they already had a number of children, they needed a house that could handle a lot of boys. So we ended up at Ruthmere, and it worked out terrific. And it's ironical that my dad worked in Mishawaka, and he made the comment that you never buy a house west of where you work, because otherwise you'll be driving into the sun on the way to work and on the way home. So we had to buy a house in Elkhart so he wouldn't have to drive into the sun on the way to work. So that's the cliff notes of how we ended up at Ruthmere. And it's a gift because there were beautiful homes along Beardsley Street in the 40s and 50s. And at one point, a couple of them were torn down and the church was built. And when the beautiful home that was right next to Ruthmere, which was a brother's home, a Beardsley brother, was actually a more modern and a gorgeous French-style home, and that home was to be the rectory or the parsonage for the church. When that home came down, unexpectedly, it torn down, my father almost had a stroke. He said, "You don't tear down things like that. Though you don't ever see those things. You just don't." And he said, "I'll be darned if I ever want a gas station on the corner where this house is." So at that point, he had determined that eventually he had to have a vehicle to preserve the house. So as fate would have it, Robert Beardsley wanted to buy it. He bought it, and quite frankly, we were tenants in the house really for 20-some years, but Robert Beardsley is the one that has maintained it and kept it as a treasure in the community. So it's unique how things work out, but that really worked out, I think, for a real benefit of the community, but the credit belongs to Robert Beardsley. He was the visionary and the guiding light that said can be restored.
So you grew up here, but at some point, everybody makes a choice to stay here. So what was your entry into civic and community life in the town where you grew up?
You got to go back to the era we grew up, but you went through high school. If you had the chance to go to college, that was great. But you also at that time had a draft deferment, so you knew when you finished college you were going in the service. So once you completed college, a service obligation or military obligation, and then came back to town to try to help on the fledgling company, the family company. And so you're just toiling with, and again, people have to realize in this point was been in the 50s and very early 60s, that business was a big difference from what it is today. A new car cost, $2,500 or $3,000 and not $50,000. And so the businesses weren't doing the kind of volume that we see today, but it just came back here to work in a family business. And I had 5 younger brothers, all who were either going on to college or wherever. And so I happened to be the first one here, and they needed cheap help.
So what was the family business at the time?
The family business was a Godfrey Conveyor Company, which had been around since the early 1900s, but that company, and that's a whole long story, but that company built primarily what I call bulk material handling equipment. And historically, the main product was coal. And if you think back, and as a kid growing up, the coal trucks would come along, deliver coal to the homes, and they'd put it in their coal bin for them. And so Godfrey, back in the early 1900s, had created equipment to be able to unload coal out of railroad coal cars and get it into trucks to be able to deliver it to local customers. But by the mid-50s, that was a vanishing breed. At one time, there were 18 coal yards in Elkhart, Indiana. And yet in the late 50s, if you made a phone call to a coal yard and there'd be a bunch listed, the same guy answered all the phones because they'd been down to one. And there was a opportunity to consider other equipment, and Godfrey did make a lot of other equipment. Sand handling, did a lot of work for foundries where they handle sand to make their castings. And then at some point, probably in around 1960, 59 or 60, had a chance to experiment with building an aluminum pontoon boat. And so that was a metamorphosis from coal conveyors to sand handling to major heavy equipment to a new idea of pontoon boats.
And Godfrey Marine is what your family is now synonymous with,
right,
and known as a leader in the industry and continues to be. And you were, so you said you were cheap help, but at some point you obviously became leadership in the company.
We're a very small company back. There'd be 15 employees, so there was not many employees. Somebody's got to make things go. And over time, yes, we grew. The product came along. I think that we had competition, a lot of competition. There were a lot. In fact, today, the heart of the boat building industry is in Elkhart County. Not to say we started it, but there was Starcraft and Godfrey were the two that were building boats before anybody knew they were fashionable. We were fortunate. We survived, we'll say, because, again, it wasn't like today. You weren't putting 350 horsepower motors on the back of a pontoon boat. The early days, the biggest motor they built was a 25. So it was a whole different world. But it all works. When you ask about philanthropy and that type of thing, I think part of the issue is first you got to survive. So you've got to feed your family and so forth, but then you can begin to think about it. And one of the things that hit me as we were building the company and had become a lot more than 15 employees, maybe had grown to be several hundred employees. Now, we were very vertically integrated. In other words, today a supplier brings parts to you and you put them together. There was nobody to make canopies. There was nobody to weld frames. There was nobody to do furniture. And so we built, in effect, either built or acquired or rented facilities to be able to make all the parts. And one of the things that hit me was the United Way would have a fund drive every year. And you'd say a company should support it, and you'd do what you could for the size of your company. And 2 or 3 of your key people would give some money, but your employees really didn't. And so at that point, it had to be probably in the 70s by then, my brother Larry was working with us and pretty darn sharp. And he said, why don't we make this fun? Rather than having this, a drudgery, oh, hey, we've got to tell everybody to give to United Way. So he came up with a plan, which was brilliant because we had 5 different plants. And so he said, let's just have a party, and we'll get ready for the party. But what we'll do is we'll say, every employee decide what charity you want to give to. And whatever charity you give to, we'll match it. And so that way we'd find out whether they even cared about charities. And these are people who are not making a lot of money. They're just working on the line or working in the upholstery or whatever. And then on top of that, if you decide to do it, then we'll give you a jacket that's got your name on it. We'll give you something for it, and you can put it on payroll where they take out a little bit each month or each week. And then we'll see how it works. And then what we'll do is we'll have a party. We'll have a Halloween party. This was Larry's idea. And we went from raising X dollars to raising 10X dollars because we found out our employees really do have things they care about. And that gave us an idea, say, those are the things we ought to try to support. the things the employees are already supporting. And if it was caps, then we'd say, all right, then we'll make sure that whatever they do, we'll match it to caps. And so that was a real trigger to realize that there is a generosity here that is more significant than people realize.
Wow. That's a great story. That's got to be like one of the early employer contribution matching programs. There might have been some others doing it, but it was probably fairly novel at the time.
I think the idea of making it a party, making it not a drudgery, but making it have fun was the deal. And we went from being a very small donor to being a major donor to the United Way. But it got even better because United Way, our biggest competitor, was in Goshen. And so they'd go to our competitor and say, you know what Godfrey's doing? They're going to outdo you. So it became the two of us. Once we figured out what they were doing, we said, we're not going to let them beat us. So you had this competition that the beneficiary at the time was United Way, but the smoker craft was huge as far as support. But I think that there was a friendly competition, and the leadership of the company are dear friends today.
Yeah. It's good leadership at that company still too.
Yes, it is.
Yours. So you mentioned Larry had this idea. Were there other people in town or in your family that you learned this, how to think about giving time and money?
I think there are people community-wise that seem to have a heart for the community. I was blessed to have a relationship through whatever with our DCO. Another one is Bob Richardson. Others who were very quietly philanthropic. I think that today, when you look at the Career Center in Elkhart and realize that was built by businessmen who said we need it, and it was built long before the current demand for this type of training, and yet Elkhart was probably ahead of most other communities in the country, not the state, the country, in having a career center that let people be prepared for a job if they weren't going to go on to additional academic education. So you saw that this community there's a thread here that says get things done, and that is something that becomes part of the DNA, I think, of the community. And I think that's what keeps you going. And what you find is that most people, once they are able to satisfy their needs, then they are willing to share, because what more do they need?
You mentioned the Career Center. We were talking a little bit earlier before we went on air, about when I was a young reporter at the Elkhart Truth. One of the first men that I encountered at the Career Center was a guy named Basil Turner.
Yep.
From CTS Corporation. And Basil was this humble, low-key guy, and I had no idea how accomplished he was or how generous he was, because what you noticed about Basil was his graciousness and his humility. And that seems to be so much a part of Elkhart County and Elkhart's story in any number of people.
And the irony of that, because you're 100% right about Basil, but the other executives at CTS were the same way. They were the driving force behind the Career Center. And the Walter Wells and the Maynard Wells and some of the other names that are familiar today stepped right up and said, by golly, if they're doing it, we're not letting them do it alone. And so it was, but to me, that is a benchmark that says, hey, they can do things a little different, a little step out of the box compared to other areas, and it's paid off. It's paid off.
And Bob, you've been one of those people too. Like you said, you've seen something that needed to be done and you've responded. The Community Foundation was founded in 1989. You probably have memories of some of those early days and got involved, I think, relatively early on. What comes to mind as you think back to the creation of the Community Foundation?
Well, before it was even founded, there was a feeling among a number of us that we needed something like that here, because there was no way for people with a charitable mindset to be able to consolidate or combine their forces. And the beauty of the Community Foundation was, one, that it was Elkhart County. It was the founders, someplace there's a list of them, but anyway, there were Goshen people, there were Middlebury people, and Elkhart people, and so forth. And then I think that maybe a couple years later or something, I know that Fid Wells and I were asked to join, and we did. And the key to the Community Foundation, though, being able to start and succeed, was the seed money that the Lilly Foundation provided, which at least got you started. And without that, it was just so hard to get these things started. And today, what we did back then is you planted acorns, and we're sitting under the oak trees, and they're going to be very large oak trees, because once it was there, and you had people like Goshen College had a fund, and people like Bill Budd, who did all the paperwork and did everything. He didn't have any computer. He had a 13-column piece of paper. But again, the CTS guy. But to see what was able to happen is absolutely astronomical. And when you think about it, Lilly has been critical from day one. They have had challenge 8 or 9 now to try to help professionalize the community foundations, let them grow. But without that first start, there would have never been a David Gunlock gift, because who would he give it to? And so having the entity here and thriving enabled that gift to be made. The real thing that happened to the community foundation that has become a real asset, the real asset, is that it enables people to accomplish their own charitable gifts without somebody telling them you have to give this or that. They can do whatever they want, but the community foundation is facilitating that, and it makes it so simple to be able to do charitable things for anyone who wishes that it's almost a gift in itself. And then the Gunlock gift gave it a chance to have discretionary money, which let them support things like the aquatic center, things like the well fields. And those gifts are the things that enable those entities to be better than expected. No, the community foundation it's something that is a wonderful tool.
And thank you for your involvement and generosity over the years as well. I think it's folks like you coming alongside us and who have made this part of this community's success story. And we like to say we're just stewarding the community's assets. And doesn't mean we can sit by passively, but it's work, but it's joyful work, and it's community work, and it's made easier when we have people like you who are leaned in to help do it. One of the things that you were a big supporter of was getting an IU outpost in Elkhart. IUSB and getting an IU perch over here in downtown Elkhart was something that you worked at over the years, and higher education's a hard nut and to crack sometimes, but there is an Elkhart location. Why? Talk a little bit about that and why that was important to you.
That's a kind of an interesting one, because what really catalyzed it was having dinner with Jack Citadine, who was taking a class at IUSB. And he said, my problem with this class is it's hard to concentrate because they're making pizza in the other half of the building, and I smell this pizza, and it's tough to say I'm going to concentrate on what's going on here. And so we chatted, and Jack, Glenn Banks were 2 early leaders, said we need to have our own location. When you think back, I taught a class at IUSB in about 1966 at the old Elkhart High School in a night class. And so since then, until we got the building, they moved around about every 3 or 4 years. Whoever would give them decent rent, and they'd get a good rent, and then they spend a fortune getting all their technology hooked up so they could be in touch with Bloomington. They were nomads. And so there was higher education here, sort of. In casual discussion, we said, we need our own location. And so that's what started that. And then a group of us had dinner with the chancellor and said, we would like to see if we get a location and get their input on it and so forth. And so we were around the table, and by the time dinner was over, we had close to $1 million already committed. I said, I guess we got some people who really believe this needs to be done. And that was the real genesis of getting it done. But then the key person on this whole deal was Jack Citadine. That building is gorgeous, thanks to Jack, because the architect's plans originally were not what they should have been. And when it first opened, I think they had almost 900 kids taking classes there. They've changed their format now a little bit, but it was a real plus. And it was fun to work on because the people who pitched in really pitched in. A lot of folks pitched in on that to get it done, and it's a plus.
As we sit here today, we're a couple blocks from that building, but we're in something we call the River District now.
Yeah.
In the Riverbend building that was just opened 3 years ago. New buildings are going up. The Amici has just opened, the restaurant downstairs, where I saw Jack walk in the other night. That's just how this is working, where there's a vibrancy coming back to downtown for a range of reasons. But you have been an investor and an advocate and a supporter. Why?
I think I have to backtrack a little bit. There was the YMCA here, and God bless Tom Housen, because he's the one that was able to take the arrows to say that it's not going to work. We've gone through everybody's money we could get, and it's not going to work. And Tom Housen,
in terms of the building at that
point, the maintenance of it, and the fact that they did not have any kind of endowment, they didn't have any kind of depreciation fund, and they were just, it had gone too long. And they're also having to pay YMCA of Chicago, wherever their district is, $50,000 a year, which they didn't have. So anyway, when Tom and I had only just met Dave Weaver, asked if we thought they could do something there for another Y, and Tom had the vision that we can do more than a Y. And when I was able to see what they did by putting together not only the aquatic center concept, but the Beacon Health Center, and get the hospital, the schools, the community, the foundation, and even the ready money that would enable us to have a world-class facility, to me, that was amazing. And then when you had a philanthropical citizen who said, if it's world-class, I'll support it. And how much? I'll support it. You let me know what you need. And was able to raise a lot of money to build, in effect, what is now, or was anyway, the fourth largest pool facility in the country, and a beacon facility that has drawn people. So to me, the aquatic center facility and that $70 million project opened my eyes. And at that time, I had met Dave Weaver and had made some calls to raise money with him, and he was a delightful guy. He was 30-some years old, and I said, holy mackerel, this guy is something else. And so once that was done, and you looked at the property around it, it was a ghetto. It was a ghetto from the 1900s. And before picture would show you. So who's the guy that said, now we got the building, but we got to clean up this mess? And Dave Weaver said he'd take the lead on it. He said, would you go with me? And I said, I'd love to. And so not often they take a 80-year-old guy and say, with these young Turks, but he just got stuff done. So if you have a chance to sail on the ship with a guy like that, you hop on. And so he's been a driving force to get things done, and it's been fun to be around somebody who just keeps marching forward.
And does so graciously, too.
Yeah, sure does. That's right. He's
getting things done, but it's not always, it's often with some wisdom and grace from where I sit. But you have this historical perspective. You've lived in Elkhart long enough to see a bunch of mayors come and go, a bunch of buildings come and go. Does this feel different?
I think the key is there seems to be, especially with Dave, because he just has this tenacity and is willing to put his heart, soul, and assets on the line personally. The idea of the public-private partnership, number one. Number two, yeah, it's got to be economically feasible, but we're not going to try to retire on what you can make out of this one thing. We're going to try to make this a better place. And the irony is, and I spent time with him long before the buildings were built, is that once the property was assembled and he had the acreage, the idea was the major developers would come in and do it. And the shock to us was when they said, no thanks. You're too small. We can't afford to put a staff in there. You can't get the rates here that you have to get. You're on your own. And that was a lot of developers had looked at it. And so Dave said, guys, we got to try it. And Without him, would I have tried it alone? No. But with a Dave, you're happy to work with him, and what do you want me to do?
You talked about sailing on the ship. It's early in the history of the River District, but are you liking what you're seeing?
I think that you're right. It's early in the history. I think as the apartments are finished and people are living in them, we will see the walkable district that this was visualized to be. The success has indicated we need parking. So as we get more parking, then the Michi can be open for lunch.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I think it's moving the right way. It just moves slower than we like when you get to my age.
I would say it's moving too slowly for Dave, and he's half your age. But what advice do you have for the generations coming after you? A young person working in Elkhart or Elkhart County who's trying to survive, but then also maybe now is doing a little bit more than surviving. What advice do you have for that next generation of philanthropists or people that just want to make this community better?
What I would say basically is get involved, but get involved by really being willing to get your hands dirty or your feet dirty and get in just pick anything. To me, our parks departments are an asset, but probably could even be better if you had people with passion and so forth who want to be involved. But just pick whatever would hit you and get involved. And to me, one of the things is you'll find you create new partnerships. And partnerships have been the biggest gift of my life, business-wise and otherwise. It's amazing what you can do with a partnership. And so having good partners is important, but you have to do it. You just get involved. Whatever organization, Loveway, Ryan's House, I think of these that are currently active and probably be glad to have support. But you don't just go to meetings. You actually get involved. And it's amazing how many doors open once you do.
I've heard you use the phrase, it's something that gets you out of bed in the morning.
That's right.
At this point, what is that for you?
I guess I've had a major gift in that I married a girl from this area, from South Bend. Of course, I didn't know much about South Bend, but when you marry somebody from South Bend, now pretty soon you get to know a lot of people in South Bend. And we tried to convert their thinking to Elkhart thinking. It was pretty good. We did pretty good. But then we have our children, and we've had 5 children, or have 5 children, and 4 of them are here. They're doing stuff that so far superior to what I ever did in my life. That keeps you going. If you're just going to get up and check on your kids, you're going to have a full day. That's a gift.
What are you trying to teach your kids or your grandkids about leadership?
I think the key thing on leadership is to think you're servant leaders. It's not a dictatorship. You're a servant of others. And once you do take that into mind, and one of the ways I learned it real early on is when I was in the service as an officer, was fine, but I learned that officers eat last. Your troops eat first. They're well-fed, they're well-trained, they're well-equipped. You'll win. But if you concentrate on yourself, you're not going to win. So officers eat last. And so if they keep in mind that to take care of yourself last as far as these organizations, but make sure you give. And I think you get to a point where you learn, then you serve, and then you counsel or advise. And as you go through the lifespan, that's how it all works.
That's a beautiful framing. And you're talking about a story you learned in the service about how you've always thought about leadership as like you've used that as a guiding principle for a long time.
Don't underestimate the strength of military training.
Wow. Bob, it's been a pleasure to have you here today. You're gracious and help our community in so many ways, and we're grateful for that. One last question that we always ask is, what gives you hope?
When I see the aquatic center, when I see the fields, when I see what's happened here in the last few years, I look at the Lerner when it could have been torn down, but thanks to Jack Citadine and others, it is a huge asset to the community. But people had to step up and give some money to get it done. Otherwise, it could have been a parking lot. So what I see has happened in the last few years, what I see happening now, Elkhart's in great shape.
This show is a production of the Community Foundation of Elkhart County. It is powered by equipment from Sweetwater and recorded at the Community Foundation's offices in Elkhart's River District. Editing is done by the award-winning communication students at Goshen College, home of one of the best college radio stations in the nation. Listen to Globe Radio at 91.1 FM. Music is provided by Sensational Sounds. Learn more about the Community Foundation of Elkhart County at inspiringgood.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. We hope you're inspired and inspire good in your community.